Welcome to our TDay webinar today. For this webinar, I will be exploring with my friend and colleague Jen Anderson the contents of the new Provident Annuitisation regulation due to come into force on the 1st of March. This is part of a series of webinars that looks at all the regulation coming into effect this autumn. Don't forget to join me on 16th of March when I'll be talking to Tim Powell of Sable International about the forthcoming changes around financial emigration. I'm Georgina Smith, and it's my privilege to look after the innate distribution and client servicing teams. And it's great to see so many of our advisors online today. Thank you very much for joining us. This session qualifies for one technical CPD point. And a quick note on CPD, for those of you who watch today's webinar in full, you'll receive a CPD certificate automatically via email. For anyone who didn't join us at the start of today or has to drop off early, or if you're watching the recording, or perhaps you're watching via someone else's unique registration link, you'll need to complete a questionnaire to receive your technical CPD point. And this questionnaire will follow shortly after today's webinar. There's also a slide pack on today's webinar, which we'll be sharing after the session today. As always, we're happy to take questions via the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll look to answer as many as possible at the end of the session. So I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Anderson, Innate's Head of Product and Communications. She's a regular on the Innate technical webinars, and it's great to welcome her back to the hot seat. Thanks, Jen. She's the absolute go-to person for my teams and indeed the rest of Innate on all things regulation and with the imminent changes and how they will affect advisors and platform providers. Today, we're looking at what's known as TDay, or in other words, Provident Annuitisation Regulation. So Jen, it feels like it's taken us an awful long time to get here. What's happened?
Morning, everybody. It's great to be back and welcome to everybody in our audience. It has taken an awfully long time to get here. And I think before we delve into the nuts and bolts of this regulation, it is useful to take a step back and say, how did we get here? And the answer is that the first time we heard about this type of regulation was actually way back in 2012. So that's at this point almost a decade ago. And what happened then is National Treasury released a series of papers. I think there were 3 of them. And one of those papers was called Enabling a Better Income in Retirement, just a discussion paper at that point. And in there, they spoke up about a whole lot of reforms that they thought would be beneficial in terms of helping people reach their retirement goals. So that's where we first saw it. Then in 2014, draft regulation came out around TDay and Provident Annuitisation, and that went through the usual process that regulation does. So industry consultation, a couple of rounds of comments and drafts, and then we saw the final promulgated regulation come out and due to be enacted and actually go live in the industry on 1st of March 2016. So that's also an awfully long time ago. That's 5 years ago. And that was actually promulgated, went through Parliament, was approved, the whole thing, and everybody was ready. And literally, I think it was a couple of weeks before, which is almost unheard of in South African regulation, that the regulator actually pulled a lot of the regulation back. So some of it went in. So for example, the change to the de minimis amount from 75,000 Rand to 247,500, that went in, as well as the changes to contribution limits, so that 27.5% up to 350,000. That all happened on the 1st of March 2016. But this portion of the retirement reform, the TDay portion specifically, was pulled back very late in the day with the promise of a postponement by a year or perhaps 2 years. And then what we saw happen is every year it got postponed again. And I think a lot of us thought, well, this thing will actually probably never happen. But here we are, it is happening. And the 1st of March 2021 is the real TDay. It's now or never.
And Jen, why was it postponed?
So quite a few reasons. So the first was there were a couple of key bodies and industries within the country who weren't comfortable with the regulation rolling out at that time. So some of the key players in that space were NEDLAC, Organised Labour, and COSATU. And really what they were saying were 2 things. The first is that these changes are quite broad sweeping and impact many, many people across the country. And the feeling was that there hadn't been sufficient consultation with broader groups. So, all of us usual suspects had been part of that process, but that potentially wider consultation was needed for this type of change. There's also been a lot of talk specifically from those areas that this change might be more appropriate to roll out when the state pension rolls out. And that's a very hot topic. We could spend a whole webinar on that. But there was almost a requirement, and it was quite strong at some points in time, to say we will not let this happen until the state pension comes in. And that obviously hasn't actually been the case because we're not close to state pension quite yet. So that was the one side of things. The other side of things was much more on the ground. And what we saw as this original TDay in 2016 came closer and closer is quite a lot of confusion and panic amongst normal members, normal people contributing to pension and provident funds. So people seem to be very worried that the regulation meant more than it actually did. That, for example, it also required forced preservation, so that when you left a job, you wouldn't be able to access any of that retirement money. You'd have to preserve it, which it doesn't. But there was strong sentiment that it actually did, and you were going to get trapped in a sense within your retirement benefit. So that was the one thing. The other thing, which I had quite a chuckle about at the time because it was quite misinformed actually, is we saw a mass exodus of government employee pension funds employees. So particularly, I remember reading at the time, a lot of teachers that worked for government schools, public schools, resigned en masse in panic to access their pension money. And, that's really far from actually being necessary, because firstly, they're invested in a pension fund which isn't impacted. And secondly, beyond that, they're invested in the government employees pension fund, which as it stands now actually doesn't even fall under the Pension Funds Act. So totally unnecessary. But there was, a lot of uncertainty and a lot of discomfort. And I think all of those things played into the regulator's decision to halt this regulation so close to the actual deadline date.
So what is TDay all about then, Jen?
I suppose the first thing that's useful to know is that it's actually referred to as TDay in the regulations, in the actual, the T's and C's of this thing. So unfortunately, for an industry that has an enormous number of acronyms already, we're already all sprouting Reg 28 and PICA and AML and all these things, TDay is going to become another word in our arsenal that we're all going to have to get used to, because it actually is what the regulator is referring to this thing as. And TDay is actually a date. So in the regulation, TDay is the 1st of March 2021, and it's a date on which two key changes come into the retirement fund space. The first being aimed at harmonizing the way retirement funds operate at the time that a member retires, and that's the main change and the key one that we're discussing today. And the second change, which I almost think of as a knock-on effect of the first, is what that means for portability between all the different types of retirement funds that we have here in South Africa.
And there's other regulation coming in as well on the 1st of March. Does this relate to the financial emigration changes which are coming in at the same time?
So they're actually not related. It does seem quite coincidental, because obviously the immigration changes do have a knock-on effect into the retirement fund space, and for retirement fund members who are planning on immigrating, who now have to operate according to the new rules that are coming. But no, they're not related. I suppose the 1st of March is just a popular date for these types of changes to roll out because it's the beginning of the new tax year. But the immigration changes we only really saw starting to emerge, I think, in the budget speech last year. So they're a lot more recent and not related. And I believe you're going to be covering those in some detail in the coming weeks, George.
Yeah, absolutely. 16th of March with Tim Powell. Do join me there. Little plug. Thank you very much, Jen. So let's get into the nuts and bolts here. What are the actual changes which are being implemented on the 1st of March, Jen?
All right, let's get into it. I think, George, for this one, if you don't mind, can we please put up a slide for our audience?
Certainly
Sometimes
can.
find seeing these things in pictures certainly helps me.
There we go.
Thank you. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, what's happening on the 1st of March, one of the key changes is harmonization of how all of our retirement funds behave at the time of retirement. So as a lot of our audience probably knows, what happens now is if you're invested in a retirement annuity, a pension fund, or a pension preserver, when you retire, you can only take up to 1/3 of that money in cash, and the rest you have to use to buy some sort of product that's going to give you a regular income while you're retired. So a living annuity, a life annuity, or something along those lines. There's also a minimum threshold there, which is another wonderful word in our industry, which is the de minimis amount. And that's the amount of $247,500. If your benefit is below that, then you can take the full amount in cash. So that's how some of our retirement funds are operating now. And the outlier from a retirement perspective is the Provident fund space, where at the moment, if you're in a Provident fund or Provident preservation, you can take up to everything, 100% in cash when you retire. So what's happening on the 1st of March is those rules are being aligned across all the retirement funds, and all the funds will now operate on this 1/3, 2/3 rule, which means that you won't be able to take all of your money from a Provident fund. When you retire, you're going to need to buy some sort of annuity product to help you with a pension in your retirement.
So, Jen, cynics amongst our audience might say that this is another way the government is trying to keep money invested domestically via Reg 28 and in turn control what people do with their money when they retire. What do you think?
Very interesting you say that. And I'm sure there are those cynics out there. I actually remember, it must have been back in 2016, I think, because these rules were quite fresh and about to come in. I went to a retirement fund conference, huge conference, and most of the attendees were trustees, employee appointed trustees. So they were members of their funds who were also trustees. And this piece of regulation was, by and large, the biggest topic at this conference. And the overwhelming sentiment at that time was that people were very uncomfortable, primarily with the concept that the government was controlling what they could and couldn't do with their money at the time they retired. And I remember I was quite shocked by how strongly people felt about that aspect of things. But I think when we think about this, we've really got to look at the bigger picture and put it in a little bit of context. So again here, George, if you don't mind, can you pull up a slide for all of us?
There we go. I think you should be able to see it now.
Thank you. So there are two really great pieces of research that we have in South Africa. They're certainly one of my favorite bits of reading. I'm sure not for everybody, but the first is the Alexander Forbes Benefits Barometer that comes out every year, very retirement focused, and the other is the Sanlam Benchmark Survey. And thanks very much to both of those organizations. We've used some of your information here today. And I'm certainly not going to talk you through all of the busy things on this slide, and you will be receiving the pack afterwards. But a few things that really jump out at me when I look at this type of information. And the first is very, very poor replacement ratio. So the 2019 Benefits Barometer, which I believe measures all of the people that are in Alexander Forbes, retirement structures, which is an enormous amount of people because they're a large organization in that space. Of all of those people, the average replacement ratio when they retire is only 32%. Practically, what that means is if you're earning 10,000 Rand a month before you retire, when you retire, you're only going to have 3,200 Rand a month. That's way lower than you need to be able to retire comfortably, according to all the studies. The other thing, which we know is a very persistent problem, is very few people preserving. And, it's a very difficult thing to get right. People do need access to money. Life does happen. Parents get ill, or, you need to have an emergency finance fund. So it is a very difficult thing, but nonetheless, we're seeing far too few people preserving in terms of what you need to do to get to retirement and actually have enough money. Anecdotally, they say, if you take your money when you change jobs once, you may be all right from a retirement planning perspective. If you do it twice, chances are you may be in trouble. So it's something to watch quite carefully. The other thing, which is the last thing I'll say on this, is the FSCA has an even scarier estimate, which we've got there, which is 6% can retire comfortably. And I think that FSCA number is probably so low because it takes into account that although some of us are in the formal retirement savings system, we've got employers who have pension funds and provident funds and the like, a large portion of our population in our country aren't in that position. They don't have any access to formal retirement savings, which I suppose is where the state pension conversation could come in. But when we look at this picture, and if I was government and I was looking at this picture, I would be very worried. And we know the government is worried about this. They want to make sure that we get to a place where people can retire comfortably and more people can do that. So this retirement reform for me is not born out of nefarious methods to try and A, control us, or B, keep our money in Reg 28 structures. I think it is born from a good place, that the government really wants to get us to a position where our elderly people can have a good retirement. And that's my take on it.
Yeah, very interesting, Jen. Thank you for that. But this Provident Fund change is quite big, and surely this messes with advisors' best laid plans for their clients' retirement.
I think that's something fair to say. It is quite a big change. And the good news is that the regulators recognize that. So these changes won't be applied retrospectively. They're only being applied from the 1st of March onwards. So what that means, firstly, is that we've got a few more acronyms and special words that we all have to memorize as part of this industry. And those are the words vested and non-vested. So what the regulations say is that all of the money that you've saved in a Provident fund or you have in a Provident preservation fund up until the 1st of March this year will still operate under the same rules that Provident funds do at the moment, as in you can take all of your money in cash when you retire. And we refer to that, and the regulations refer to it as a vested benefit. And you'll be able to, to still do what you want basically with that when you retire. It's only contributions from the 1st of March this year into Provident funds that will operate according to the new rules. And those are going to be referred to as non-vested benefits, and all pension benefits and retirement annuity benefits are also then classified as non-vested.
What about growth around this vested money, Jen?
So growth is taken into account. So, and I mean, that's vital, I think, because otherwise that pot would just shrink and shrink every year with inflation. So if, for example, you have 100 Rand that's vested on the 1st of March, and by the time you retire, it has grown and it is now 5,000 Rand, that full 5,000 Rand will be a vested benefit. What I should also mention here is that the minimum amount that we've talked about already, that 247,500, will only apply to the non-vested benefits of money together. Only the non-vested bit will need to be below 247,500 in order to
Oh, Jen, I think you just froze up for a minute. Perhaps you can just go over that that part on the minimum amount again for us, please.
Sure. Is my connection a little bit more stable now, George?
Yes, much better. Thank you, Jen.
Okay, great. Apologies for that. I'm not sure what happened. So the point was that de minimis amount, that 247,500, that's applied only to your non-vested benefit. So if, for example, you have R1 million in your combined benefit when you retire, but the non-vested bit is only 200,000 Rand, you'd still be able to withdraw that full non-vested bit in cash if you wanted to, because it's below the 247,500. So that's quite an important point to know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But for people reaching retirement age soon, this change is coming very late in the day for them, isn't it, Jen?
Most definitely. And I think it could really be seen as a changing of the goalposts, if you like, for people that are, let's say, 5 or 10 years out from their retirements. And the good news is that the regulators recognize that as well. They've recognized that people that are so close to retirement have done all of their retirement planning with a certain expectation of what they would be able to do with their benefit at retirement. And so what they've said is that anybody who's 55 or older on the 1st of March is exempt from these regulations. So let's say, for example, I'm 57 and I continue contributing to a Provident fund after the 1st of March this year. All of my contributions, my full retirement benefit, I would be able to take in cash when I retired if I wanted to.
So Jen, just to summarize, we've talked about the Provident funds and the changes that post 1st of March, clients will no longer be able to access 100% of their Provident investment at retirement. The money that they've saved prior to the 1st of March will be vested, and all growth will be vested as well. And finally, those clients who are 55 and over at the 1st of March this year will be able to still access 100% of their Provident fund at retirement. Is that correct?
Yes, spot on.
So So what does this mean for preservation funds and retirement annuities?
In terms of the bigger retirement fund environment, the regulations are quite clear that all the types of retirement funds need to be able to cater for this concept of vested and non-vested benefits. So in the retirement annuity space, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll see all retirement annuity funds opening their doors and accepting vested benefits, because obviously that is quite a major thing for them in terms of their systems and processes and the like. But what it does mean is that every retirement fund will need to adjust their fund rules, which are almost like a memorandum of incorporation for a retirement fund. Those fund rules will need to change to be able to cater for the concept of vested and non-vested benefits. So practically, what this means when I think about this is from the 1st of March, there's going to be absolutely no difference between an employer pension fund and an employer provident fund. They'll operate the same way, both in terms of contributions and at retirement and at resignation. And in the same way, there's going to be absolutely no difference between a pension preservation fund and a provident preservation fund from the 1st of March. They're going to be identical. So what I think we're going to see happening as a result of that, and it won't happen overnight, it will be gradual, is we're going to see members being more free to move their money between the different types of retirement funds. So let's say I'm contributing to my employer's provident fund and I change employers and my new employer has a pension fund, I could move my money from the one fund to the other. So we're going to see a lot more of the mixing of benefits between these different types of retirement funds. And in the long run, as a consequence of that, I think what we may see is a further contraction of the number of retirement funds in this country. So quite a few years ago, there was a proliferation of retirement funds out there. And over time, we've already seen that number decrease quite significantly. And I would think that as part of these regulations, we may see something like that happening again. So if I think about it, if I'm an employer and I've got a pension fund and a provident fund, from the 1st of March, why would I need both? Keeping in mind that all of these things come with regulatory overheads, administration and expenses. So if you can consolidate, I think a lot of people will take that opportunity up and reduce the number of funds that they have.
I think that simplification will be welcomed by many areas across the financial services industry, clients, advisors, providers alike. What about from a tax perspective? I thought we weren't allowed to move, or there were certain significant tax implications when you move between the different types of funds.
That used to be the case, George, and that's the second part of the regulation that's rolling out on the 1st of March, which I mentioned at the beginning, and to my mind is almost a consequence of the first. So the rule at the moment, the old rule, is that you're not allowed to move from a more restrictive type of fund to a less restrictive. So for example, you wouldn't be able to move from a pension fund to a provident fund on a tax neutral basis. And that's because at the moment, the provident fund is less restricted. Internet problem notification. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you just if you wouldn't mind just going back to the start of that answer, we got a little bit of freezing in there, Jen, but yeah, I can see you're back now. So yeah, if we can just roll back to the beginning of that one.
My apologies.
No, it's fine.
My connection's telling me it's strong, but obviously some demons in the system today. So what I was saying is that if you were moving from a more restrictive to a less restrictive fund in the current rules, you wouldn't be able to do that on a tax neutral basis. So you wouldn't be able to move from a pension fund to a provident fund, for example, because the provident fund is less restrictive at retirement. And in the same way, you wouldn't be able to move from a pension preservation fund to move money between.
So sorry, Jen, you just cut out a little bit there. Are you back with us?
Don't mind, and I'm going to change my internet connection in the hopes that it helps us. So if you don't mind bearing with me in the audience
Sure.
as well for a second, let me just switch between connections and see if that helps us.
Thank you, Jen. That's great.
And if I lose you, I'll rejoin in a sec. Why don't
No,
you tell everybody a joke, George?
mine are all rude, Jen. I can't tell my jokes. I think I might be strung up if I tell my jokes.
There's a way to put somebody on the spot.
I know.
Fill the
Thank
awkward
you.
silence while I change my.
I should have a crawling child behind.
Sorry about that, George.
No, it's no problem. No problem at all. Are you back with
All
us?
right, I'm on my 3G connection, so hopefully that's a little bit better.
We can certainly hear you,
problems,
even if you freeze a little bit in the face. We can certainly hear you. So perhaps if we can just go back to the part about the moving between funds from a tax perspective, I think that would be quite useful.
Yes, and sorry about the connection again.
No worries.
The way this is one of the changes that's coming in on the 1st of March as well, if that part didn't come through clearly. And how the rules work at the moment is if you're moving from a more restrictive fund to a less restrictive fund, you wouldn't be allowed to do so on a tax neutral basis. So if, for example, you wanted to move from a pension fund to a provident fund, you couldn't do that. And that's because the provident fund is less restrictive at retirement than the pension fund is. And similarly, from a pension preservation fund to a provident preservation fund, you wouldn't be allowed to do that on a tax neutral basis either. From the 1st of March, all of the funds are harmonized in terms of how they behave at retirement. So the concept of a more and less restrictive fund in the pension and provident space is really falling away. And what that means is that from the 1st of March, you can move between any of those funds and it'll all be on a tax neutral basis. So that opens up a lot of possibility for clients and for members. They can really be a lot more portable in terms of what they do with their retirement savings and not need to worry about the tax consequences of doing something like that.
And what about transfers from retirement annuities, Jen?
That's the one outlier. So you still won't be able to transfer from a retirement annuity to a pension or provident fund or a preservation fund, even after the 1st of March. And that's because a retirement annuity fund is still more restrictive than those funds in terms of the pre-retirement withdrawal rules. So as most of our audience would know, you can take one withdrawal from your preservation fund after you've preserved it and before you retire. And when you leave your employer and you have a pension or provident fund, you can take a withdrawal at the time that you either preserve or choose to cash out. Whereas with the retirement annuity, you're pretty much stuck. No withdrawals really until you retire. So because of those differences, you still won't be able to move from a retirement annuity into any of the other funds on a tax neutral basis.
So the difference around withdrawals is really the last difference between the retirement savings products, Jen?
Yes. These pre-retirement withdrawal rules really is the last key difference from a benefit perspective between retirement annuities and the rest of the funds. Obviously, there's still differences in terms of contributions because employer contributions are treated slightly differently and just operate slightly differently to retirement annuities. But from a benefit perspective, that pre-retirement withdrawal really is the last difference. And I think it's going to be so interesting to keep an eye on this space going forward and over the next couple of years to see if the regulator has any appetite for harmonization in that space. I certainly haven't heard anything. There would be a lot of consequences to that, and it may be almost contrary to what they're trying to do in terms of helping people get to retirement. But nevertheless, it is the one glaring difference now, isn't it? So yeah. I would say watch this space. Maybe in 5 to 10 years' time, we'll be doing another webinar like this.
I look forward to it, Jen. What about withdrawals around the vested versus non-vested parts of the Provident? How's that going to be handled?
That's very important, actually. It's one of those practical things, but for all of us on the ground dealing with clients, it is something that's very important to think about. So how the industry is rolling this out is if you have a client who wants to take a pre-retirement withdrawal and they have both vested and non-vested money within their account, is that withdrawal will come proportionately from the vested and non-vested portion. So that's how the industry has agreed that these changes will be rolled out for the 1st of March. There was nothing specific in the regulation. So, the industry as a collective got together and decided that that was probably the most appropriate. What's happened over the last couple of days is SARS, literally in the last week or so, has come back to say they're not sure they're comfortable with that approach. And potentially they would be more comfortable with a pre-retirement withdrawal first coming out of a vested benefit and then only from non-vested. And I suppose you can understand that because it almost disincentivizes people from taking that pre-retirement withdrawal. So the industry is in discussions with SARS, and we're really not sure where it's going to end up. We hope that it ends up with a proportional arrangement, A, because I think that's a little bit easier for clients to understand, and B, because that's how we've all architected our solutions. So, this regulation is the gift that keeps on giving. Just when you think it's going in and there'll be no more drama like there was in 2016, very last minute now, SARS is weighing in and saying potentially that those rules will have to change. But I think for the purposes of our audience today, let's all assume that it's proportional from the vested and non-vested portions when you take a pre-retirement withdrawal, and as and when and if we hear anything different, those things will take a little bit of time to roll out. In an operational and systems environments, one certainly can't just click your fingers and change that methodology. So yeah, let's watch this space.
Yeah, I mean, you led me perfectly into my last question for you. This has been a lot of tech development for some providers second time round. It's been a lot of tech development for people to get in place, platforms to get in place, product provider to get in place very quickly. Is everyone going to be ready?
It certainly is a concern, and it is a lot of work. It's an enormous amount of background work, particularly around tracking a vested and non-vested benefits. And you've got to get it right. Obviously, this is people's retirement savings. I am a little bit concerned, and I think particularly with this piece of regulation, because it's rolled out in such an unusual way. 2016, everybody was geared up. The tech people, systems and processes, everybody was ready for the change. And then at the last minute, had to backtrack and actually unknit all that knitting, which in itself is quite a lot of work. And then we had a very strange cadence to the regulation, where every year there was a sort of looming possibility that it may be this year, maybe it's this year, March, maybe 2017, maybe 2019. And I think the problem with that is that it's almost made us a little bit punch drunk with TDay. We didn't know when it was coming in. And the sense certainly that I got is maybe this thing's never coming in. And every year it gets pushed out and pushed out. So, you almost couldn't blame a product provider if they were caught a little bit on the back foot that suddenly now, after all this time, this thing is here. And it's a bit of a mad scramble to get everything ready. So I hope everybody's ready. And I suppose all that I can say, all that I'm certain of, is that our businesses are ready and will be up and running 1st of March 2021 with these changes. And, I'm very excited for this. I think it's a move in the right direction to try and help all of our people get to a place where they can retire comfortably. And I mean, that's a goal I think everybody should be able to support.
Yeah, I completely agree. And yes, it has certainly felt like a lot of work internally to get us to this place, but I'm extremely proud that we are in a place where we're able to be ready across the entire group, which is a great place to be. Jen, I've got a few questions that have come in. Are you happy for me to move across to them?
Yes, with pleasure.
So first one I'm going to go to is from Julian. Julian Denny, thank you so much for joining us today, Julian. For those over 55, you said the new regs don't apply. However, what is the case for someone over 55 joining a new Provident fund after the 1st of March?
That's an excellent question. There are various pieces of regulation that would come into play there, because you are over the age and you could still preserve. I'm trying to put all my pieces of regs together in my brain. Julian, that's really a good question. My gut feeling is that those benefits will also be vested, even though you are in a new Provident fund, you're a new member. But if you don't mind, I don't like giving an answer that I'm not 100% certain of. So I'm going to take that one away and check in with people that are much cleverer than me in terms of this regulatory stuff. And we'll get back to you on that with a definitive answer. But my gut is that would also be vested.
I can't believe there's people who are much cleverer than you on this regulation, Jen. Another question coming in. Hi there, is the 247,500 Rand still in place post 1st of March 2021?
That's an excellent question, and I'm actually sorry I didn't cover it in the main part of the presentation, because I've heard it coming up again and again. Because originally in 2016, the 247 was supposed to go in with TDay. So I think it's quite logical to wonder, now that TDay is going in, is the 247 still here to stay, or is it adjusting? So that 247 is remaining in place. That number won't be changing on the 1st of March. That is still the number, as is the contribution limit regulation. So that 27.5% up to a cap of 350,000 Rand a year, those contribution limits from a tax deductible perspective are still remaining in place as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Jen. A point here being made by Alan. Alan, thank you so much for joining us, a regular on these webinars. Great to see you. Point being made by him, Regulation 28 doesn't apply to living annuities. You just have to keep it in mind. So you can invest a large portion of your LA offshore via asset swap, however. Only thing that these changes restrict is the ability for a person to take their Provident fund as cash and physically externalize. What would you say to that, Jen?
I think Alan's spot on, and knowing Alan, I haven't worked with Alan for ages, but Alan's very sharp with these things, so I'm not surprised that he's spot on with this. That's exactly right. Reg 28 doesn't govern the living annuity space, and I know often what I think is our regulations seem so bumpy in South Africa. Why does it apply pre-retirement and not post? But the reason is because we've got all these different regulators and all these different pieces of regulation. So the retirement funds operating under the current Pension Funds Act, and that's why Reg 28 governs there, yet living annuities and life annuities under the Insurance Act, which is why we see the disconnect in those rules. But that is an excellent point. I know, sometimes people like to follow Reg 28 as a guideline in a living annuity, but it's certainly not a hard and fast rule. And if your client requires exposure that's different to that, that's certainly something that you can do. Yeah, so thanks, Alan. It's a great point.
And your answer leads me nicely into Robin's question. Hi, Robin. Great to see you on today. As you mentioned, Jen, this change is part of the enablement of better income for retirement. And it feels as though these changes seem to be part of a bigger picture. As an example, we've seen the alignment of tax deductible contributions across retirement funds, flexibility and withdrawals at retirement, which is now the 247. Is there anything else in the plans going forward that's part of the bigger picture, if there is one?
That's a great question. So nothing definitive that we see that's anywhere close to being promulgated, as far as I know. So when that enabling a better income in retirement paper came out, one of the things that it did talk about, which we mentioned at the beginning, was forced preservation, at least to an extent. And I think that was just a bridge too far. So I think in a world where the government could roll these things out, and do what it wanted without having to consider all of these broad stakeholders and the bigger picture, as Robin said, that maybe would have rolled out at the same time as this TDay. But I think, given where we are as a country and where our members are on average, from a financial well-being perspective, that, as I say, was probably just not possible. So that we haven't seen anything. The only other thing that's constantly rumbling away in the background is this talk of the state pension. I do think it's something the government is serious about, but how it would roll out, when and even if, there's no clarity there as yet. And, what always gives me a lot of comfort with these big conversations is the regulator never operates in isolation. They really are very good at engaging industry, all sorts of stakeholders to try and understand what's really going on the ground. So that benefits barometer that I mentioned, for example, is a fantastic tool that Alexander Forbes has to really try and get to grips with what is the state of retirement in South Africa, and that kind of thing the government, I'm sure, uses extensively as well.
Wonderful, Jen. Thank you. Really, a point being made by Condi coming in. Thank you for joining us, Condi. Is there going to be work done around the costs of these annuity products with this move to compulsory annuitisation? Given that it will be compulsory, there needs to be some assurance that these products are not too expensive. What would you say to that, Jen?
So I think that there's a few things going on in that question, and it's something I'm very passionate about is low cost retirement saving solutions. So I think firstly there's a question around the cost of retirement annuities, and I think the second part of the question would actually be what are the costs of the post-retirement solutions as well, the living and the life annuities, because we're now, as the question says, sort of forcing people into some of those products. Yes, and I think cost is certainly something That's been a hot topic in the industry for a long time. And there's still certain pockets where I think there's an enormous amount of fee pressure and a drive, often from advisors in the industries, DFMs and others, to try and drive down those costs for members. I would also say that in the retirement annuity space specifically, the industry really has come a long way. So, I know, historically, retirement annuities across the board really had a bad reputation. You could get stuck in there, you could have terrible termination fees, all sorts of things. And, I think since then, particularly platform style retirement annuities that are very transparent, they're member choice, they're pretty simple, you find that they actually are quite cost effective and they're pretty good value for money. But I think the stigma of how retirement annuities used to operate in the past still hangs over some of those products to an extent. Yeah. But yes, I mean, to my mind, the only way for fees to come down is for us as an industry to keep demanding it, to keep putting pressure and looking after the best interests of our clients.
I think moving to a much more transparent and paperless environment is certainly going to be helping us in that respect as well. Nice little plug there for Innate, the digital solution. So I'm going to get told off by marketing for that as well. Something clarification required here from Eunice, if I may. Thank you very much for joining us, Eunice. So she says, and I think it would be worth just going back over these over 55 rules, if you wouldn't mind, Jen. I've read that these members, the over 55s, remain members of the same Provident fund, and all new contributions will be vested. Changes will only apply to the new contributions made to new Provident funds joined after the 1st of March.
So I think Eunice is trying to help us with the question that I answered initially, and thank you very much for that. That may be the case. As I say, my gut sense is it's all contributions, because what we do know is you would be able to transfer your Provident benefit post 55 and continue contributing to that transferred benefit, and that would still be considered vested. So in the spirit of that, I would think that brand new contributions to a new benefit would probably follow the same rules, but I definitely will check in, and George, we must make a note to make sure we get back to the whole audience in terms of what the answer is to that. Potentially we can put it in a thank you note so that it's front and center.
Yeah, absolutely. Question here that's come in anonymously. Thank you very much. What is the influence of TDay on previously disallowed contributions for deductions or reducement of tax payable after retirement, also under section 10A or 10C?
Oh my goodness.
You can pass. Where
I firstly have to give George a very stinky look for bringing up such a difficult question. And secondly, have to bow out and say that I'm certainly not a tax expert. I too am very interested in the answer to that because it sounds fascinating. So that's another one that I'm going to recommend we take offline and we check in with all of our tax gurus, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, I think absolutely. We always get a few, especially the tax questions amongst here, and I think it's just important we give those a little bit of time and thought before we respond. I'm actually going to draw it to a close there, Jen, if it's okay. I think we've covered the new regulations coming in around TDay in some great detail, and of course, as you said, we're going to share the slides. I really hope our audience has found it useful and helpful. And don't forget that if you weren't able to watch from the beginning today, you're able to, or you're watching a recording, you're able to get hold of your CPD points by answering a short set of questions, which will follow after the webinar today. Quick reminder to everyone, I hope you'll join me on the 16th of March when I'll be chatting to Tim Powell of Sable International about the changes in regulation also coming in, which are to do with financial emigration. Look out for the invite, it's coming out shortly. So it only remains really to thank Jen. Thank you very much, entertaining and insightful as always. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jen.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who's been in the audience today. What I will say is there are some really good questions that we didn't get a chance to get to today. We'll gather up all of those themes and we'll make sure we get back to you. And also to extend a further offer that if you have specific questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us one-on-one. We're always happy to have conversations and to help to provide insight where we can. So that offer is open to everybody as well. Whether you're part of our current stable of advisors or not, we're happy to take questions and to help wherever we can. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.